Iran, a name we hear all the time. News stories talk about its conflicts, nuclear plans, secret deals, and rising tensions. But behind the headlines lies a much deeper story, one that most people have never heard. Did you know Iran's future was written thousands of years ago? Not in politics, not in newspapers, but in the Bible. That's right. Long before it was called Iran, this powerful nation was known by another name, Persia. And the Bible doesn't just mention Persia. It tells us how it began and even how its story will end. But here's where things get really interesting. The Bible says that in the final days of history, Persia, modern-day Iran, will be part of a terrifying alliance that rises up against Israel in a massive, prophetic war known as Gog and Magog. A war so big, it's mentioned in the book of Revelation itself. But Persia wasn't always the enemy. In fact, Persia was once a tool in God's hands. It was the empire he chose to free his people, rebuild his temple, and fulfill the ancient words of the prophet Daniel. Shocking, right? So, what changed? And more importantly, what does this mean for us today? Hidden in the pages of the Bible is a mystery about Iran that connects the past, the present, and the future. A divine story is unfolding, and we're living in the middle of it. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is something most people never talk about. This is not just about politics or war. It's about God's plan for the world and Iran's powerful role in it. If you're ready to uncover this ancient mystery, drop a 777 in the comments and let's dive in together. The true story of Iran, from Genesis to Revelation. It all begins at the very start of human history, in the book of Genesis. After the great flood, when the world was given a second chance, humanity began again with one family. Noah and his three sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These weren't just survivors. They were the fathers of future nations. From their children came the peoples, languages, and kingdoms that still shape the world today. In Genesis chapter 10, we find what many call the Bible as first world map, a list of names that reveals where the nations came from. Genesis 10:1 says, "This is the account of the families of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, from whom all the people of the earth descended. And among those names are two that lead us straight to Persia, Iran. The first is Madai, son of Japheth. Madai's people became fierce mountain tribes, known as the Medes. They settled in the rugged, snow-capped mountains of what is now northern Iran. These weren't city builders or kings. They were warriors tribes that valued loyalty, strength, and survival. Living high in the hills, isolated from big cities, they learned to depend on each other. They were tough, proud, and built around strong family bonds. Madai is considered the ancestor of Iran's ancient northern heartland. His descendants would one day help form the mighty empire of Persia, an empire that would change the course of history and fulfill Bible prophecy in ways we're only beginning to understand. Then comes the second name, Elam, the son of Shem. His lineage gave rise to the Elamites, who settled in the lush, fertile lands of southwestern Iran near the Persian Gulf. Unlike the Medes, the Elamites developed early urban centers and wielded political influence. They controlled key trade routes and fertile agricultural plains, making them a formidable force in the ancient Near East. But the Elamites were not just neighbors to the early people of God. They were aggressors. Because in Genesis 14, the stage is set for the first great international conflict recorded in the Bible. A war that would not only test alliances, but reveal something far deeper, how heaven responds when its chosen ones are threatened. In this moment, 4 eastern kings, including Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, formed an alliance and swept westward into the land of Canaan. They plundered cities, enslaved entire populations, and among the captives, they took someone precious, Lot, the nephew of Abraham, the man of God. Do you see what just happened? The descendants of Shem and Japheth, the early forefathers of Iran, didn't just rise to power. They became the first to challenge God's covenant family. Elam, backed by other eastern kings, dared to invade the land where Abraham walked. And the conflict wasn't just about territory. It was a confrontation against the promise God had placed on Abraham's life. So what did Abraham do? Did he cower? Did he negotiate? No, this was a defining moment. With only 318 trained men, his own household servants, he launched a daring nighttime assault. Outnumbered, outarmed, and vastly outmatched, Abraham attacked the invading kings, shattered their forces, rescued Lot, and returned with the freed captives and spoils. How could such a small band of men defeat a coalition of eastern empires? It wasn't military brilliance. It wasn't superior strength. It was God's favor. This was no ordinary battle. It was a spiritual message written in blood and fire. No eastern power, no ancient empire, no rising kingdom can succeed against the one who walks in covenant with God. This was not just a victory. It was a statement, a declaration across the generations. Heaven defends what it ordains. And even today, the echoes of that first war remain. Could it be that what we are seeing now between Israel and Iran is not just history repeating, but a spiritual cycle resuming? That the ancient lands of Elam and Madai, once challengers of God's chosen, are once again moving into prophetic position? What if the hostility wasn't born in recent decades, but was planted long ago in the pages of Genesis, now growing, maturing, and reawakening for its final confrontation? Because while Elam once marched with an army, and while Abraham once stood alone in faith, that same spiritual war is far from over. And the question remains, who still stands under covenant today? And when the next battle comes, who will heaven defend? But the people of Elam didn't vanish into dust. They weren't erased from history, nor did their legacy crumble with the fall of a single city. No, they endured. They watched empires rise and fall like tides. Centuries passed. Kings lived and died. Tribes scattered and regathered. And while the world focused on the thrones of Egypt and Babylon, the forgotten children of Elam, once defeated by Abraham himself, were growing. Their bloodlines flowed quietly through the eastern lands of Mesopotamia, where two ancient peoples, the Elamites and the Medes, shared rugged and fertile terrain. Elam settled the rich southern plains, where rivers fed life and prosperity. The Medes, hardened by the mountains of the north, were shaped by wind and stone. Their region was brutal, yet it forged warriors with a resilience few could match. Two nations, two spirits, one destiny, quietly building in the shadows. Empires rose and vanished around them. The world changed. Yet through the ashes of obscurity, something new began to stir. First loose clans, then tribal confederations, then kingdoms, and finally an empire, Persia. But don't be fooled by their pagan beliefs or foreign gods. These nations, Elam, Media, Persia, were never outside the reach of God's plan. Though they worshiped idols, God still spoke their names. Though they didn't yet know him, he had already written their roles into the script of redemption. Through the voices of his prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, God declared something stunning. Not just one prophecy, but two. And both would be fulfilled with such terrifying precision, they would echo through history like thunder long after the events themselves. The first prophecy, spoken through Isaiah and echoed by Jeremiah, foretold that Elam and Media would rise not as enemies of Israel, but as the very tools God would use to punish Babylon. Babylon, the empire that had crushed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and dragged God's people into exile, would not go unpunished. God had already chosen the hand that would bring its downfall, and that hand belonged to the united peoples of ancient Iran. Have you ever stopped to wonder how God can use even those outside the covenant to fulfill his will? How a nation known for idolatry could become a hammer in the hands of the Holy One? But the second prophecy was even more astonishing. God wouldn't stop at judgment. He would use Persia, not just to punish, but to liberate. Through the prophet Isaiah, God named his chosen deliverer more than 150 years before the man ever took a breath. A king, a foreigner, a man who did not know God, but whom God knew intimately. Isaiah 45:1 declares, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him." Anointed, that word reserved for prophets, priests, and kings of Israel, placed on the head of a pagan ruler. Why? Because Cyrus would become the agent of freedom. He would decree the return of the exiles, fund the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, and write himself into the holy story of a people not his own. But before Cyrus could rise, God began laying the foundation. In the 8th century BC, a man named Deioces, king of the Medes, began to unite the scattered tribes of Elam and Media. From their union, the first Iranian imperial capital was born, Ecbatana, a name lost to most, but carved into prophecy. This was the beginning of something holy, hidden in something political. His grandson, Cyaxares, took that foundation and transformed it. He didn't just lead, he reformed. He reshaped the army into a fearsome force, one so formidable that it brought down Nineveh, capital of the dreaded Assyrian Empire, whose cruelty to Israel was unmatched. And with Nineveh's fall, one of Israel's greatest oppressors collapsed beneath the weight of prophecy. Do you see it? The prophecy was unfolding step by step. God was not merely watching history, he was writing it. Persia was not an accident. It was an instrument. God was raising a people from the hills and valleys of Elam and Media. A people who once warred against his chosen would now become his chosen tool. Not for glory, not for empire, but for judgment and redemption. Because when God speaks, time listens. And when God appoints even a pagan king, no force in heaven or hell can undo it. So if God could call a man like Cyrus by name, before his mother even conceived him, if he could use Elam and Media, long forgotten by men, as the key to Israel's restoration, then how much more is he orchestrating even now? How many insignificant nations, people, and moments are being shaped for a destiny we cannot yet see? Because the God who raised Persia from the dust is still at work, and the script he began has not yet reached its final act. Yet even as Persia grew in might, stretching its influence across continents and shaping the world stage, its destiny was already written. Long before its armies rose to power, long before its kings sat on thrones of gold, God had already revealed its future through the whispers of prophetic dreams. And the first to see it with divine clarity was not a king or a general, but a young Hebrew prisoner. Daniel, a teenage exiled captive, stripped from his homeland and thrust into the very heart of the empire that had destroyed everything he once knew. It began with catastrophe. The Babylonian army, under the ruthless leadership of King Nebuchadnezzar, stormed Jerusalem. The city's mighty walls were crushed. The temple, the house of the living God, was ransacked and left in ruins. Thousands were taken as prisoners, marched across the desert into foreign lands. Among them was a young man named Daniel, whose life had just been shattered. Can you imagine what that moment felt like? Being torn from your family, your culture, your worship, your identity, everything familiar left behind in a smoldering ruin. Yet in that darkness, God chose him, not because of power or lineage, but because of faithfulness. Inside the glittering halls of Babylon, surrounded by corruption, idolatry, and pagan wealth, Daniel refused to bow. While others feasted at the king's table and drank the empire's wine, Daniel kept himself pure. And because of this unwavering loyalty, God granted him something few have ever received, a divine window into the future. Visions not just of his generation, but of every kingdom that would follow. And at the very heart of the empire that had laid Jerusalem to waste, Daniel began to see something astonishing, that Babylon would not last, that another empire would rise. one forged by two arms of silver. An empire that would one day take center stage in the destiny of his people, the Persian Empire. And this journey into the future began with a dream. While Daniel served faithfully in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth was suddenly gripped by terror. One night, a dream came to him haunting, vivid and impossible to forget. A towering statue appeared, crafted from various metals. A head of gold, a chest of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet mixed with clay. But Nebuchadnezzar, disturbed and prideful, issued a challenge unlike any other. Don't just interpret my dream. Tell me what I dreamed without me saying a word. No magician, sorcerer, or wise man in all Babylon could do it. Fear spread like fire. Death awaited them all. But then God's servant stepped forward. Young Daniel, empowered not by intellect, but by revelation, was brought before the king. He sought the Lord in prayer, and heaven opened. That night the mystery was revealed. Can you picture it? This teenage exile, standing before the throne of the world's greatest tyrant, calm, fearless, glowing with the light of divine truth. And with humility and authority, Daniel said, "No man can do what you ask, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." Then with precision and power, he described the king's dream in exact detail without ever having heard it. And what followed was one of the most extraordinary revelations in human history. Daniel declared, "You, O king, are the head of gold." Babylon, the splendor of kingdoms, the first in the prophetic timeline. But after you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours, symbolized by the chest and arms of silver. That silver did not represent a single nation, but two arms, two peoples. The Medes and the Persians, distinct yet united, bound in strategy, divided in power. And from those two, the Persian arm would rise stronger, overpowering the other and taking the lead. Have you ever considered that God spoke the future of Persia before it was even a global power? That while Babylon was still standing proud, heaven was already preparing its replacement? The statue was not just art. It was a timeline, a divine road map, a sequence of kingdoms stretching from Daniel's captivity all the way to the end of the age. And in that moment, Daniel made it clear, Babylon will fall, and the throne will pass on, not by accident, not by ambition, but by divine appointment. The empire that had torn down Jerusalem would itself be torn down, and the kingdom of Silver Persia would rise at God's command. But this prophecy was not merely for kings and scholars. It was a message to all generations. God is the one who raises up empires. God is the one who casts them down. And no nation, no matter how mighty, stands outside his plan. So now, as we look at the rising influence of Iran, do we remember that its origin was predicted in a dream over 2,500 years ago? That its power then and now was seen, measured, and placed within the tapestry of prophecy? And if God revealed Persia's rise before it happened, what has he already shown us about its fall? Because the vision didn't end with silver, and Daniel's dreams are not finished. Far from his homeland, surrounded by the towering idols and golden halls of Babylon, a young man named Daniel waited. Though a foreigner in exile, his spirit remained anchored in the promises of God. He'd seen visions, glimpses of kings yet to rise, empires yet to fall. And now those visions were stirring, ready to break into the world like a storm long held back. Could it really be happening in his lifetime? Would the God who had spoken through prophets and dreams now fulfill his word through the rise of an unlikely king? Long before this moment, the prophet Isaiah had spoken a name that no one could have imagined would matter. Cyrus, a Persian king, not yet born, would be used by God as his chosen instrument. In Isaiah 45:1, the Lord said, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him." Daniel knew this prophecy. And now, In real time, he was watching it take shape. Cyrus, young and ambitious, had emerged from the rugged highlands of Persia. With brilliance and boldness, he conquered the neighboring kingdom of Media, uniting the two thrones into a single unstoppable force, the Medo-Persian Empire. As his influence expanded, so did his confidence. One by one, the powers of the ancient world fell before him. And then he turned his gaze to the jewel of empires, Babylon. The day foretold in visions had arrived. But the conquest that followed was no ordinary siege. Inside the palace of Babylon, King Belshazzar, the arrogant and reckless grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, was throwing a grand banquet. 1,000 nobles filled the hall, drunk with wine and pride. Music echoed off the marbled walls. Golden goblets clinked, and laughter masked the tension creeping beneath the surface. But then Belshazzar crossed a line no king should dare approach. In an act of unholy defiance, he ordered that the sacred vessels, those taken long ago from the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, be brought forth. These were not mere trophies. They were holy instruments once used in the worship of the living God. And now, in the heart of pagan Babylon, they were raised in mockery, toasted to false gods of gold, silver, stone, and wood. Can you imagine the silence that followed? The sudden shift in the atmosphere? In that moment, judgment arrived, not with thunder, but with the silent movement of an unseen hand. Before the stunned eyes of the king and his nobles, fingers appeared and began to write on the wall. 4 words: Min, Tekel, Parsin. The music stopped. The wine soured. Belshazzar's face turned pale. His legs gave way. No one in the room understood the meaning of the words. The wisest men of Babylon were powerless. But Daniel was called. He had stood in the courts of kings before. He had interpreted dreams, spoken truth at the risk of death. And now, once again, he stood boldly to deliver a message that would shake the foundations of an empire. He looked the trembling king in the eye and declared, "God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians." Daniel 5:26-28. Even as those words were still echoing off the stone walls, the prophecy was already in motion. Unseen by the revelers, the armies of Cyrus the Great had executed a brilliant maneuver. They had quietly diverted the Euphrates River, lowering the water level that once protected Babylon's walls. Under the cover of night, soldiers crept along the dry riverbed and entered the heart of the city. Miraculously, the inner gates had been left unlocked, just as Isaiah had foretold in Isaiah 45:2. "I will go before you and will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron." God himself had opened the gates of Babylon. No sword was needed. No siege engine broke the wall. Heaven had already moved the pieces. That very night, King Belshazzar was slain. And just like that, Babylon, the empire that once seemed invincible, fell without a cry of war. The head of gold once dreamed of in Daniel's visions had passed. The chest of silver had taken its place. Cyrus, king of Persia, now stood at the helm of history. But little did he know, his greatest act was still to come. For 70 years, the people of Israel sat in exile, weeping beside the rivers of Babylon. Their harps hung silently upon the trees. Their songs of Zion became echoes of memory. It seemed as though the covenant had been crushed beneath the boots of empires. Jerusalem lay in ruins. The temple, once filled with the glory of God, was nothing more than ash and rubble. And then something utterly impossible happened. A foreign king, a pagan king, rose from beyond their borders and did what no one could have expected. Cyrus, ruler of the rising Persian Empire, issued a decree. The Jewish people could return home. But Cyrus didn't merely release them. He empowered them. He financed the rebuilding of the temple. He restored dignity to a displaced people. And he didn't do it halfway. He sent them with royal authority led by Zerubbabel, a direct descendant of David's royal line, and Joshua, the high priest of Israel. These men, bearing both kingly and priestly authority, would lay the foundations of what had been lost. They would begin to restore the very dwelling place of God on earth. And so Persia, in an astonishing twist of divine design, became the one empire in history not to destroy Israel, but to rebuild it. What kind of nation does that? What kind of king finances the house of a foreign god? But even while this act of restoration was unfolding, God revealed to Daniel a deeper, darker vision, one that hinted at Persia's destiny beyond mercy. In a prophetic vision, Daniel saw 4 terrifying beasts rising out of chaotic waters, each more disturbing than the last. The second beast caught his eye a monstrous bear, massive in form, rising up on one side with 3 ribs clenched between its bloody teeth. And then came a voice from heaven, rumbling with ominous clarity, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." What did this mean? The bear was Media and Persia, and its uneven stance raised on one side was no mistake. It reflected the reality that while Media and Persia joined together as one empire, Persia would ultimately dominate. The 3 ribs represented its greatest conquests: Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt, empires devoured by Persia's insatiable hunger for dominion. And history confirms it with frightening precision. First, Lydia fell, its wealthy cities in Asia Minor, no match for the Persian tide. Then came Babylon, the golden head of Daniel's earlier statue humbled in a single night. But Persia didn't stop. Like the beast Daniel saw, it marched onward. Under Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus, Persian forces swept through the Sinai desert and crushed Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. With the fall of Egypt, the final rib was torn from its place. But the visions were not finished. Years later, Daniel stood by the banks of the Ulai River, perhaps reflecting on all he had seen. And it was there that heaven opened again. What he saw next was clearer, more detailed, and more terrifying. He beheld a ram, wild, proud, violent, with 2 great horns. Yet one horn was taller than the other, and the taller horn had grown up later. The ram charged westward, northward, and southward, conquering without resistance. Nothing could stand in its way. Then the voice came, "The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia." Once again, Persia stood at the center of divine prophecy, but this time not as a benefactor or builder, but as a force of dominion. One horn stood taller Persia again, overshadowing Media, and the direction of its charge west, north, and south mirrored its military campaigns. A spiritual portrait of empire unstoppable, unchallenged? Or so it seemed. But suddenly, the scene changed. From the west came a goat gliding across the earth without touching the ground. So swift was its motion. A single great horn protruded from its forehead, powerful and precise. And in a flash, it charged at the ram, shattering it, trampling it into the ground. The ram that none could withstand was demolished in a moment. This was no ordinary conflict. It was the rise of the next empire, Greece under Alexander the Great, who would overthrow Persia with supernatural speed, conquering the known world before the age of 30. Daniel may not have known the names, but he understood the message. Persia, for all its glory, for all its divine use, would one day fall. For 70 years, the people of Israel sat in exile, weeping beside the rivers of Babylon. Their harps hung silently upon the trees. Their songs of Zion became echoes of memory. It seemed as though the covenant had been crushed beneath the boots of empires. Jerusalem lay in ruins. The temple, once filled with the glory of God, was nothing more than ash and rubble. And then something utterly impossible happened. A foreign king, a pagan king, rose from beyond their borders and did what no one could have expected. Cyrus, ruler of the rising Persian Empire, issued a decree. the Jewish people could return home. But Cyrus didn't merely release them. He empowered them. He financed the rebuilding of the temple. He restored dignity to a displaced people. And he didn't do it halfway. He sent them with royal authority led by Zerubbabel, a direct descendant of David's royal line, and Joshua, the high priest of Israel. These men, bearing both kingly and priestly authority, would lay the foundations of what had been lost. They would begin to restore the very dwelling place of God on earth. And so Persia, in an astonishing twist of divine design, became the one empire in history not to destroy Israel, but to rebuild it. What kind of nation does that? What kind of king finances the house of a foreign god? But even while this act of restoration was unfolding, God revealed to Daniel a deeper, darker vision, one that hinted at Persia's destiny beyond mercy. In a prophetic vision, Daniel saw 4 terrifying beasts rising out of chaotic waters, each more disturbing than the last. The second beast caught his eye, a monstrous bear, massive in form, rising up on one side with 3 ribs clenched between its bloody teeth. And then came a voice from heaven, rumbling with ominous clarity, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." What did this mean? The bear was Media and Persia, and its uneven stance raised on one side was no mistake. It reflected the reality that while Media and Persia joined together as one empire, Persia would ultimately dominate. The 3 ribs represented its greatest conquests: Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt, empires devoured by Persia's insatiable hunger for dominion. And history confirms it with frightening precision. First Lydia fell, its wealthy cities in Asia Minor, no match for the Persian tide. Then came Babylon, the golden head of Daniel's earlier statue humbled in a single night. But Persia didn't stop. Like the beast Daniel saw, it marched onward. Under Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus, Persian forces swept through the Sinai desert and crushed Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. With the fall of Egypt, the final rib was torn from its place, but the visions were not finished. Years later, Daniel stood by the banks of the Ulai River, perhaps reflecting on all he had seen. And it was there that heaven opened again. What he saw next was clearer, more detailed, and more terrifying. He beheld a ram, wild, proud, violent, with 2 great horns. Yet one horn was taller than the other, and the taller horn had grown up later. The ram charged westward, northward, and southward, conquering without resistance. Nothing could stand in its way. Then the voice came, "The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia." Once again, Persia stood at the center of divine prophecy, but this time not as a benefactor or builder, but as a force of dominion. One horn stood taller Persia again, overshadowing Media, and the direction of its charge west, north, and south mirrored its military campaigns. A spiritual portrait of empire unstoppable, unchallenged, or so it seemed. But suddenly, the scene changed. From the west came a goat gliding across the earth, without touching the ground. So swift was its motion. A single great horn protruded from its forehead, powerful and precise. And in a flash, it charged at the ram, shattering it, trampling it into the ground. The ram that none could withstand was demolished in a moment. This was no ordinary conflict. It was the rise of the next empire, Greece, under Alexander the Great, who would overthrow Persia with supernatural speed, conquering the known world before the age of 30. Daniel may not have known the names, but he understood the message. Persia, for all its glory, for all its divine use, would one day fall. And yet, even with that fall still far away, Persia in its prime was the center of the world. Its domain stretched from India to Ethiopia, its roads paved with the spoils of conquest, its laws unchangeable, its palaces unrivaled. At the height of its majesty under King Ahasuerus, known also as Xerxes I Persia, his throne was set in the resplendent city of Susa, the ancient capital of Elam. Today, we call this land southwestern Iran. It was there, surrounded by marble pillars and golden vessels, that the greatest empire on earth held its court. And it was there in Susa that God did the unthinkable. He didn't send an army. He didn't raise a prophet with thunder or fire. Instead, he raised a young Jewish woman, orphaned, hidden, and unknown Esther. She carried no sword. She wore no crown by right. But she had been divinely placed for such a time as this. And with wisdom, beauty, and courage, she would outwit empires and conquer the greatest threat to her people, not through force, but through faith. The greatest empire in the world would be turned by a single woman's voice. Isn't that just like God to use the mighty for judgment and the overlooked for deliverance? In the days of Persia's grandeur, King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, threw a celebration unlike anything the empire had seen. For 180 days, a half-year of feasting and spectacle unfolded before nobles and princes from all 127 provinces. Gold glittered, wine flowed, and the power of the king radiated through every extravagant display. But when that royal festival reached its climax, the king invited all the people of the capital city, Susa, to a final 7-day feast. This time, it was not just the elite, it was everyone. But in the fog of wine and pride, the king made a fateful decision. Wanting to boast not only in his wealth, but in his queen, he summoned Vashti to appear before the guests wearing her royal crown, so all could behold her beauty. But Vashti said no. One word, one refusal. And in an instant, the empire's pride turned to shame. Humiliated before his guests and his entire court, Ahasuerus reacted in fury. Vashti was banished from the palace, and her throne was left vacant. What followed was more than a search for a replacement. It was a kingdom-wide beauty contest proposed by the king's advisors. Every province would be searched for the fairest young virgins, who would be brought to the royal harem. There, each one would undergo an entire year of purification and preparation before meeting the king. It was a process as lavish as it was ruthless. Among those chosen was a young woman named Hadassah, but no one in the palace knew her true identity. To them, she was simply Esther. Hadassah was an orphan, a daughter of the Jewish exiles, secretly raised by her cousin Mordecai. She lived quietly among her people in Susa. Yet now, through the unseen hand of God, she was brought into the very heart of the Persian Empire. Her name was changed, her heritage concealed, and yet something in her spirit remained unshaken. Esther captured the king's heart. And though he did not know she was a Jew, he placed the crown upon her head and made her queen of Persia. But even as Esther ascended, a shadow crept through the palace. Haman, a descendant of the Amalekites' ancient enemies of Israel, had risen to a position second only to the king. With cunning and pride, he demanded reverence from all. But when Mordecai, Esther's cousin, refused to bow, Haman's pride turned venomous. He would not be satisfied with punishing one man. Instead, he conceived a plan to wipe out an entire people. He went to the king with veiled words describing a scattered people who lived by strange laws and refused to obey royal decrees, without naming the Jews. He painted them as a threat and offered a bribe to have them destroyed. The king, trusting his advisor, gave him the royal ring and sealed the edict. On a set date, all Jews across the empire, men, women, children, would be executed. Can you imagine the panic that followed? The scrolls were read aloud in every province. Chaos erupted. Mourning filled the Jewish communities as the people realized their lives had been signed away with ink and authority. But in the midst of despair, Mordecai tore his garments and sat in sackcloth and ashes at the palace gates. He sent word to Esther, "You must act." But how? Esther knew the law. To approach the king unsummoned meant death, unless he extended his golden scepter in mercy. She hadn't been called to him in 30 days. If she entered that throne room, she risked everything. Fear gripped her, but faith was stronger. After fasting with her people for 3 days, Esther rose and walked toward the throne. Every step was a test of faith. And as she entered the inner court, the king saw her and raised his scepter. God had granted favor, but Esther didn't rush. She invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Then, mysteriously, she invited them again to a second feast. She waited not because she was unsure, but because she understood divine timing. And at that second banquet, the hidden truth was unveiled like thunder. "If we had only been sold into slavery," she said, "I would have remained silent. But a decree has gone out for my people, and for me to be destroyed." The king's face twisted with rage. "Who would dare do such a thing?" he demanded. And Esther turned. "Our enemy is this wicked man Haman." The room erupted. Haman fell to his knees, groveling for mercy. But justice was swift. On the very gallows he had built for Mordecai, Haman was hanged. Yet the danger was not over. Persian law could not be reversed, not even by the king. The original edict of death still stood. But God was not done writing redemption. Esther and Mordecai proposed a bold new decree: give the Jews the right to defend themselves. The king agreed and sealed it with the same ring that had once doomed them. Across the empire, Jews prepared for battle. And when the appointed day came, the tables turned. What had been meant for annihilation became a day of divine victory. The Jewish people rose up and prevailed over their enemies. Susa erupted with joy, and from province to province, mourning turned into celebration. Without realizing it, the Persian Empire, once poised to become the grave of God's people, had become their fortress. A pagan throne had become a divine shield, and a Jewish orphan, hidden in a palace, had become the vessel through which God preserved his promise. So now ask yourself, what if you were born for such a time as this? Because in the silence of God, his hand still moves. In the shadow of death, his light still leads. And in a world that plots destruction, he still raises up Esthers. After Esther's miracle in the royal courts of Susa, Persia seemed to fade quietly from the spotlight of Scripture. The great empires of the world continued their rise and fall. Babylon was long gone. Greece rose and declined. Rome marched into dominance. And for a time, the nation once used to deliver Israel receded into the background of the biblical narrative. But silence does not mean absence, and obscurity does not mean irrelevance. Persia may have left the center stage, but in the background, it was still watching, still listening, still searching the heavens. Centuries later, while the world groaned under Roman occupation and prophecy felt like a distant echo, something remarkable happened. A moment so familiar, it's recited every Christmas season. And yet, few realize the layers of meaning hidden beneath its surface. Matthew 2:1-2 tells us, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." But who were these Magi? These weren't mere stargazers or casual travelers. The Greek word magoi refers to a caste of wise men-learned priests, astronomers, and scholars from the East. While their exact country is not named in the text, all historical and cultural signs point toward one ancient region, Persia, modern-day Iran. The Magi were heirs to a long-standing tradition of Persian priesthood. These men were renowned across the East for their deep understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and prophecy. They studied not only the stars, but ancient texts including, very likely, the prophetic writings of a man who once stood in their homeland's royal courts, Daniel. Imagine the scene. Centuries earlier, Daniel, taken captive as a teenager to Babylon, rose to become the chief of the magicians. And wise men under Nebuchadnezzar, and later served in the courts of the Medo-Persian Empire. He left behind more than interpretations of dreams. He left behind a timeline of prophetic countdown, pointing directly to the arrival of the Messiah. Daniel 9:25 gives it plainly. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. Could it be that these magi had preserved Daniel's writings for generations? That they not only honored him as a prophet, but took his words so seriously they calculated the arrival of the Messiah? Is it possible they saw the sign in the heavens and instantly knew, it's time? What makes this moment so profound is not only their knowledge, but their response. These Persian sages, men of status and comfort, left behind their homes, their positions, and their security to follow a star across barren lands. They journeyed for weeks, maybe months, not for trade or political alliances, but to worship a child. Not just any child, but the child foretold in ancient prophecy. And when they finally arrived, they didn't come empty-handed. They brought gifts, each one soaked in prophetic symbolism. Gold declaring his royalty. This child was not just a prophet. He was a king. Frankincense used in priestly worship, acknowledging his divinity. Myrrh, burial spice, whispering of the sacrifice to come. This baby was born to die. Whether they fully understood the weight of their offerings or not, their journey revealed a divine mystery. They were proclaiming without knowing that this child would be king, would be God, and would be the Lamb. Meanwhile, what was Jerusalem doing? Herod, seated on the throne, was plotting murder. The religious scholars, just 5 miles from Bethlehem, remained silent, unmoved. And yet these foreigners from Persia, outsiders by blood but seekers in spirit, were the first to bow in worship before the newborn Messiah. Think about that. Persia, the nation once sent by God to free the exiles and rebuild the temple, once again became the chosen vessel to honor the arrival of the Savior. Not by force this time, but by reverence. Not through royal decree, but through worship. From Daniel's scrolls to Bethlehem's stable, Persia remained quietly woven into God's unfolding plan, even in exile, even far from the covenant land. God was stirring hearts, planting seeds, and preparing a nation once more to play its part. And this raises a powerful question for you. Would you have recognized the star? Would you have followed it across deserts, carried costly offerings, and bowed low before a promise made flesh? Because the wise men didn't just come to visit a child. They came to recognize the arrival of eternity into time. They came to bear witness that the king had come, and Persia would be among the first to kneel. This was no coincidence. It was prophetic alignment. And in this final revelation, we see the full arc of God's faithfulness. Persia the liberator, the threat. The observer once again becomes the first worshiper at the feet of the king. The story of Israel and Iran is not only a tale of conflict, it's a tale of prophecy, of rebellion and redemption, of nations rising and kneeling, of God working through both darkness and light to bring about his unshakable plan. And Persia was there for every chapter. But the story of Iran, ancient Persia in the Bible, doesn't end in the restoration of Jerusalem or in the glory days of temple rebuilding. It doesn't fade out in the courts of Cyrus or the courage of Esther. That was only a glimpse of what Persia once was. The full story carries us forward not just to Bethlehem, where redemption was born, but to the edge of time, to one of the most chilling prophetic scenes in all of Scripture. Because the God who revealed Persia's beginnings also unveiled its final role, and it is not one of mercy. It is one of confrontation. Through the prophet Ezekiel, the Lord unveils a vision that pierces through centuries into the end of days. A moment known as the War of Gog and Magog, recorded in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. This is not fiction. This is not poetic allegory. It is a divine warning. It is a vision of a coming storm that gathers force and fury aimed not at empires of man, but at the heart of God's covenant, Israel. Son of man, God says in Ezekiel 38:2, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him. The tone is fierce. The judgment is fixed. God is not offering negotiation. He is declaring war. And then comes the coalition, the names that cause any discerning heart to tremble. Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, to Gomer, all aligning, all assembling like war horses at the edge of prophecy. Persia modern day Iran is listed first, not as a supporter, but as a spearhead. Can you feel the shift?